tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang gunuttarang upacayang namasami. So I'd just like to begin this evening with a few words about my own path into monkhood, into Buddhist monastic form. I grew up without any religious beliefs. I found the religious tradition in the country in which I was born as alien and baffling. I couldn't make any sense of it. It didn't mean anything to me at all. And as a child, I thought that religion meant believing in things. You had a set of things that you believed in, and then you tried to live by them. And it didn't seem to me that that was really necessary. In my teenage years, a few questions started to arise in my mind. And the major one was, what's a good way to live? Or what's the best way to live? I wasn't even sure whether that was a legitimate question, whether you can compare lives and say, that's a better life than this one, in the way that you could with material objects. But it seemed to me a question that I couldn't put down. And the other question that went round and round in my head was, why is there so much suffering in the world? Why is there so much cruelty? Why is there so much injustice? Is it just the way things are and something which has to be accepted? Or is it possible that the amount of suffering in the world could be reduced? And if the amount of suffering in the world is not a fixed thing that we simply have to make peace with, but can be reduced, then what is the responsibility of every human being towards trying to participate in that reduction of suffering? So these questions led me on a long search, mostly through reading, until eventually I came across the teachings of the Lord Buddha, and they immediately made sense to me. I had no sense that this was an exotic Asian philosophy, but it seemed obvious. There was just not a single sentence, not a single phrase that I could reject or argue with. So, at the age of 16, I think I was at that time, then I came to some early conclusions that we all suffer, as human beings, because of ignorance, we don't understand ourselves, we don't understand the world we live in, and that at any moment there is, or any situation, there is that basic ignorance, then craving arises, defilements arise. But that ignorance is not a fixed element of human existence. It is dependent upon a lack of education or training. And the Eightfold Path of the Buddha provides a holistic, a comprehensive, a truly effective means of educating human beings to free themselves of ignorance and all of the defilements that arise in the presence of ignorance. And it seemed to me that the best life would be one of applying oneself to the Eightfold Path, applying oneself to Threefold training, in other words, to reduce and eliminate, if possible, ignorance, to realize liberation, and to share that knowledge with others. So, following on from that, I finished my schooling and worked to make some money, and then set off overland from England to India and spent a couple of years traveling, learning, experiencing things before returning to England with a dilemma. I was convinced in my mind that the conclusions that I'd drawn as a schoolboy were correct, but I still had no idea about how to put that into effect, how to lead a life based upon those principles, to be able to apply them without compromise. While I'd been traveling in Asia, I'd heard about a young Englishman who had ordained as a monk in the forest tradition, as a very charismatic teacher who had decided to disrobe and to set up a vipassana or a meditation retreat center in England. And so I applied to participate in a 10-day course. It was the first such course I'd ever attended. And in the evening Dhamma talks, his teacher would tell stories about his life as a monk in Thailand. And suddenly it was just completely obvious to me what I'd been looking for, the way of life that I'd been looking for was the way of the bhikkhu. Some months later, I joined Ajahn Sumedho's community in England and spent the Vasa of 1978 just outside Oxford, a place called Oakenhole. And following that, went to Thailand because for me, my my goal, my ideal was to be a bhikkhu in a Buddhist country, in a Buddhist environment, Buddhist culture. I had no interest in propagating Buddhism in non-Buddhist countries. And I was fortunate enough to be accepted as a student by Venerable Ajahn Chah, and became his Satimiharika, his my Upajjhaya, in 1980. And I've been living in Thailand continuously since late 1978. So I can say that since I first met Ajahn Chah, as I first set foot in Wat Pah monastery, his monastery, I've never had a single thought of disrobing, of leaving the monastic order, because it seems to me that the form of the bhikkhu expresses, it contains within itself everything that I have ever wanted in my life, and it lacks nothing. It is, for me, the very best way to be a human being in this realm. As bhikkhus, we are inheritors of this wonderful tradition. It's my belief, I have no proof of this, of course, but I would think well over 90% of the, so this is complete speculation on my part, 90% of the Arya Pugalas who have appeared in the world since the time of the Buddha have spent their lives as Buddhist monastics. So just what an honor it is to be able to live this life and to live according to the Vinaya of the Lord Buddha. In Thailand, and I think in Burma sometime, we can get quite excited about Buddha relics. And I myself love to go and pay respects to Buddha relics. But the most profound Buddha relics are the Dhamma Vinaya that the Buddha left behind for us to live our lives by. So when you think that all of the Sikkhapadas in the Patimokkha, all of the regulations that we lead our lives by, these are not arbitrary, they weren't devised by wealthy people to maintain their hold on power. Every single rule was devised by a fully enlightened Buddha. That's quite incredible to reflect upon. And if we were all fortunate enough to be offered a time machine, and we were to be able to transport ourselves back to Veluwana or to Savatthi at the time of the Buddha, if we were to walk into those monasteries and we were to see Venerable Sariputta and all his disciples walking up and down, or Venerable Mahamoggallana, and we were to go over and bow to them, I think we would all be acknowledged. And they would be say, yeah, we're bhikkhus. So there is that unbroken lineage. A fellow monk made a wonderful observation to me some time ago. He said, if you study human history over the past 2,500 and more years, all the upheavals and the wars and the famines and the prosperous and the and the unprosperous periods of humanity, all the things that have been going on throughout the world, every 15th day of that whole period, there has been communities of bhikkhus coming together and chanting the Patimokkha. You think 2,600 years in terms of Patimokkha's, how many Patimokkha's there have been? There's not been a single Patimokkha where there hasn't been a community of bhikkhus, whether it's in Sri Lanka or Burma or Thailand or wherever. There's that kind of continuity. So that's a kind of a vertical continuity, lineage. And then we have this horizontal connection. So I am being born as a bhikkhu and brought up and lived my life as a bhikkhu in Thailand, most of you in Burma. But we meet and we're immediately, we know we're part of the same Sangha. And we meet bhikkhus from Sri Lanka and Cambodia and so on. And I would say also from my experience, when we meet Mahayana monks, despite differences of doctrine, differences of Vinaya in some cases, there is again this great sense of brotherhood and community. So I think this is a wonderful thing, and that we have a part to play in the preservation of the Buddha Sasana, in the furtherance and to play a part in even the flourishing of Buddha Sasana in future. And that will come about through bhikkhus like us putting all of their hearts and minds into the study of the Buddha's teaching, into trying to put those teachings into practice in our daily life, and hopefully even to realizing the fruits of that practice. Well, there's pariyati, patipati, pativeta. This is the progression. This is the organic link between these three areas of our life. In terms of patipati and practice, there are so many different approaches these days, and many of them are like technique oriented, and we have traditions which are identified by particular meditation technique that is taught by the teacher or the founder of that tradition. My teacher was not identified with any one specific technique, although he would generally teach anapanasati more than any other technique. But the emphasis was on the threefold training and appreciation of how that threefold training is developed in harmony. That is to say, that it's not a step-by-step process, but one in which at any one time there have to be elements of the training of conduct, elements of the training of the heart, elements of training wisdom, simply that one of those three areas of the training may take precedence, may be to the fore, and to be supported, backed up by the other two. So in the case of sila, then at the very least we need to have the wisdom and understanding of why exactly each precept or each sikkhapada is important to keep and to take care of. and to practice by. In keeping precepts, then we see how important the development of mental qualities, virtues, particularly mindfulness, sati, khanti, patient endurance, and metta. These three we can see again and again how they strengthen our practice of sila. Hiriyottappa are not fixed qualities of the heart, but they can be cultivated, they can be developed through application, particularly in the wisdom faculty, yoniso manasikara. So these three areas of the training always showing this profound interplay. We develop the practice of sila, the intention to refrain, and our ability to maintain our sila is dependent upon our wisdom, our understanding, our reflective ability, our yoniso manasikara, and dependent upon hiriyottappa, on mindfulness, on patient endurance, on metta, karuna. In our development of meditation, in which we're specifically applying ourselves to the abandonment of the unwholesome, development of the wholesome, and then keeping our precepts well, with integrity, cuts down radically feelings of regret, of remorse, mental agitation, and through keeping our precepts we have wholesome sense of pride and a feeling of self-respect and friendship with ourselves. We like to be with ourselves. One of the many drawbacks of poor sila, or not keeping sila, is that it's very unpleasant to be with yourself. So people with poor sila tend to get caught up in all kinds of distraction to prevent themselves having to be with themselves. So sila gives us the motivation and the interest, enjoyment of being with oneself and learning how to train the mind. And the Buddha said, where there's no wisdom, there's no jhana, no wisdom, no meditation, no wisdom, no meditation. So we need to be using our intelligence to be dealing with hindrances as well, and using our reflective abilities. Wisdom, of course, itself coming when there is a firm foundation of sila and mental cultivation, of all the virtues that support wisdom. So I think it's a very useful, fruitful reflection on the Eightfold Path seen as the Threefold training, and that's very much the emphasis in my tradition. Talk a lot about Threefold training, not so much about the Eightfold Path. But of course they're synonymous, it's just a different way of talking about the same thing. But in order to see the holistic and the interrelationship between the different aspects of the path, then the Threefold training, I think, brings that out very clearly. So in terms of the practice of Dhamma and all the different techniques, one of the constant challenges for meditators and practitioners in whatever school and whatever tradition that we are following is how to create a seamlessness and a sense of continuity between what we're doing when we're sitting with our eyes closed, walking up and down, and what we're doing the rest of the day. So this distinction between formal practice and informal practice, meditation, daily life, this is a challenge for everyone. My approach to this is to suggest that a very skillful way of looking at practice of Dhamma is in terms of the four right efforts, samma vayama. If we, whatever meditation technique that we may be applying, we can summarize that at the beginning of the meditation, our effort is primarily to create a relationship between the mind and the meditation object such that unarisen hindrances cannot arise in the mind. So exactly how do we focus upon our meditation object in such a way to protect it from hindrances? This is the first challenge. Now, of course, that's very difficult, and it's quite likely that a hindrance will arise. And in that case, then the second of the four right efforts is required, the effort to abandon the arisen, unwholesome Dhamma. As we practice mindfulness, become stronger, we become more skilled at protecting the mind and preventing unarisen, unwholesome Dhammas from arising, then the wholesome Dhammas start to appear. We now are applying more and more clearly the third of the four right efforts. We are introducing into the mind, we are inviting into the mind, we are planting within the mind wholesome Dhammas, and particularly the bojjhangas or enlightenment factors. As the bojjhangas begin to appear, then our next challenge is to stabilize them, to take care of them, to develop them further. So I would say one way we can look at meditation practice in a way that unifies all the different techniques, I would say, is to look at it in terms, rather than specific meditation objects, but to look in terms of what we're actually doing. We're actually learning very important life skills. We're learning all the skills that we need to create a relationship between the mind and the chosen object such that unarisen, unwholesome Dhammas do not arise, or in such a way that we can swiftly abandon unwholesome Dhammas that do arise. We're learning how to plant within the mind the bojjhangas and how to take care of them and to bring them to maturity. Now, if we look at everyday life, or everything we're doing when we're not sitting with our eyes closed or walking up and down, then I would say that we are applying exactly the same right efforts. Whether we're seeing to our daily chores, whether we're studying, whether we're working, whether we're on alms round, whatever we might be doing, our main effort is to prevent unarisen, unwholesome dhammas from arising, and to deal as swiftly, efficiently, effectively with those that have arisen. We are looking to bring into the mind wholesome dhammas appropriate to the situation that we find ourselves in, and when they do start to arise, we recognize their presence, we're learning the skills of looking after them and bringing them to maturity. So seen through the lens of the four right efforts of Samma Vayama, we have created a bridge between meditation practices and daily life. Now in our practice then, a common question that I often receive from lay meditators, or lay Buddhists in particular, is what kind of indications are there that we are progressing in Dhamma? And there are many different ways of answering this question. One very simple answer that I'm very fond of, given by a great bhikkhu who I look up to very much. He said that the number of things, if you're progressing in the Dhamma, the number of things that make you suffer should be decreasing, and the number of things that make you happy should be increasing. But if we take another way of looking at this, I would say that just one of many points here is in our relationship to worldly dhammas, that the untrained mind is extremely sensitive to the worldly dhammas, that gain and loss are really big issues. They affect us emotionally to a great extent. Praise and blame, again, the untrained mind is incredibly sensitive to praise and blame. So gain and loss, status, loss of status, praise and blame, pleasure and pain, these are the 8 worldly winds that blow the worldly mind around. As we're practicing in Dhamma, we become less and less sensitive to those worldly winds, and you may well have had an experience where maybe somebody treats you very badly, unexpectedly accuses you of something that you haven't done, for example, and the person walks away, and you look at your heart and you realize that you're not suffering very much, and you think to yourself, wow, even a year or two ago, if somebody had treated me like that, I would have been so upset. I would maybe not been able to sleep at night, I've been so upset. But now I feel very little. I feel something, but very little. So this is one thing that can be observed. I think the best time to observe yourself is when things happen unexpectedly. When suddenly you're put in a situation, you have no time to prepare for it. And that's a real test of your mindfulness, of your equanimity, of your loving kindness, or whatever. But I would also say that at the same time, as the mind becomes very solid and there's an unmovable aspect of the mind that starts to manifest, we become very sensitive to dukkha, much more sensitive. And the suffering of others, which for the untrained mind we can be very insensitive to, or turn our backs on. We don't want to have to deal with it. It makes us depressed or anxious. The mind is moved by dukkha in a way that it has never been before. Earlier we were having some discussion about karuna, and for me it's significant that the Buddha realized liberation under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya through wisdom. But after the Lord Buddha had enjoyed the fruits of liberation for not so many days at all, really, considering the huge amount of effort that had preceded it, his mind turned to this question of whether or not he should teach others. And we know this story that he, for some short while at least, he started to doubt whether this teaching was too profound for other human beings to appreciate or to benefit from. And then as the story goes, the Brahma, Sahampati, came down and reassured him that there are beings with little dust in their eyes who can indeed benefit and can indeed realize the fruits of holy life in following teachings of Lord Buddha. So the Buddha got up and walked all the way to Sarnath. It's like 200 and something kilometers, and in order to teach the Panchavakki, the 5 ascetics, and then for the following 45 years, he spent nearly all of his waking moments teaching others, teaching them the path to liberation. So for me, the Buddha's wisdom manifested in compassion. And then the expressions of the Buddha's compassion over the next 45 years were guided, were molded by wisdom. The Buddha's constantly developing ways of expressing these profound truths in language, in images, in metaphors, similes, stories that will be most effective in opening people's eyes to the truth. So this very profound relationship between panya and karuna, seen in the life of the Buddha himself. And the Buddha was enlightened with wisdom, and that wisdom resulted in karuna, compassion, and motivated by compassion, the Buddha used his great wisdom and understanding to propagate the teachings that lead to freedom from suffering. So I have a number of students and friends in China these days, and monks in the Vajrayana tradition. And sometimes we talk about differing approaches to metta and karuna and helping others. And my presentation, if you like, of the Theravada way is to say that in Theravada, it's not that we don't have compassion for others. Maybe don't talk about it quite so much. But our emphasis is on the helping self and others together. That the more you truly help yourself, the more you are able to help others. The more you help others wisely, the more you can help yourself. This principle goes back to the time of the Buddha himself. You remember teaching the acrobat and his helper. So, to give a very simple example of this, there are many people who feel great wish to try to make the world a better place, to help to alleviate the suffering in the world, and they join organizations devoted to noble causes. But in the cases where they lack that internal culture, they're not developing themselves, they don't know how to look after their own minds, then in many cases, a year or two down the road, they get completely burnt out. And so their heroic efforts to help others are very short-lived. Or else, something that we can observe quite often in groups of people devoted to helping others is that they quarrel a lot. They have a lot of arguments because it's not just for themselves that they're concerned. It's for the welfare of others. So they feel very passionate about their beliefs, and so there tends to be a great deal of ditthimana, attachment to views and opinions, which undermines the effectiveness of their work. Also commonly observed is that if you are successful at anything in the world, you're going to receive a lot of praise and blame. And if you have not developed that inner strength, an inner wisdom, then you will fall into the traps of praise and blame. So the wish to help others, that kind of compassion, lacking wisdom, can be very short-lived, and it can bring all kinds of problems when there is a lack of wisdom. So as in the Theravada tradition, what I'm saying is, like we say, you can't just give yourself to others like this kind of bodhisattva ideal. We say you have to know how to look after yourself if you really want to help others effectively over a long period of time, like 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, not just a couple of years until you get completely burnt out. So we're talking about a harmony of effort, harmonizing one's effort towards training oneself and to helping others. But as we practice in the formal sense of that word, the meditation practice, and this is sometimes portrayed as being like a selfish pursuit, then as meditators we can only say, well, the thing that we wear away through meditation and constantly rubbing and eroding away is that sense of self and self-importance, and that the fears and anxieties and desires based upon the conceit of me and mine. So the more we practice, the less of the asmimana, there is, the less of the ahankara, mamankara. We're not creating self and ideas of possession in the same way. So the less and less you take seriously this idea of me and mine, the more you look closely, it just crumbles away. It can't sustain any serious investigation. So the more that the sense of self starts to melt or to crumble, then the more the compassion for others arises, because it's not just that sense of distinction between self and others is no longer so rigid and so obvious as it was. And so it's not a sense of working to be free from my suffering, but it's suffering wherever it appears, in whatever form. There is that wish to alleviate suffering, to eliminate suffering by abandoning its causes. And to do that through practice of Eightfold Path or the Threefold training, and to promote and to explain and to share one's understanding of that training with others. So I'm very much in harmony and in agreement with Venerable Ajahn Kamai's views on the importance of karuna. It's very much chimes with my own approach and understanding of this. Seems to me that wisdom and karuna go hand in hand, and that the wiser you are, the more compassionate you are. The more compassionate you are, if it's compassion in the sense that the Buddha was teaching, then the more wisdom we find. Because it's through the recognition of dukkha, the first noble truths. Four noble truths are all to be found in that recognition, that comprehension of the first noble truth. There is dukkha. The dukkha is like the great riddle, the one thing that we need to understand. As the Buddha's enlightenment. Enlightenment is the comprehension of dukkha. So that means that apart from arahants, we don't really know what dukkha means. When we think, we can use the word suffering very glibly, but we don't really understand what dukkha means. This is what enlightenment is. The liberation is the true understanding of this meaning of dukkha. But the more that we look closely at the five khandhas, we look closely at this body and mind, we learn from our experiences in meditation, we learn from our experiences in the world, then the clearer and clearer it becomes. And I would suggest that the more clearly we see dukkha, that the more the compassion arises in our mind, and that's a good indication that we are on the right path. So I think I've probably spoken enough for this evening. I'd like to give opportunity for some questions and answers. Now I'd like to end my discourse at this point. The Buddha taught very clearly that any kind of meditation technique must be aimed at taking the mind beyond the five hindrances. So whether it's a technique based which includes the use of the thinking mind and reflection, say the anusati meditations, or a meditation based upon observation of physical processes, one which you're not using the discursive mind at all, the unifying point is that they should take the mind beyond the 5 hindrances. So as long as there are hindrances in the mind, then there's no samadhi. And if there's no samadhi, then there's no yatha bhuta yana dassana, there's no seeing things according to truth. So this is our challenge, how to take the mind beyond the 5 hindrances. Sometimes then can see that the mind's really ready for meditation. The moment you sit on your seat, you feel you're really ready and enthusiastic and committed. But there are also times, even for bhikkhus, where you just sit there because it's the time to sit, or you're lacking some real sincere motivation. And I think this is really a very important point, that meditation will only really develop when you have chanda, when you have kusala chanda, dhamma chanda in the mind. And this is your first question when you sit down: is there dhamma chanda in my mind? And you have to be very, very honest with yourself. And if there's not dhamma chanda, then you need to stimulate dhamma chanda, and you should have a number of different skillful means to do that. You see what works for you. So it might be recollecting the virtues of the Buddha, or stories of the Buddha's life, or of the great arahants of the time of the Buddha, or particular Dhamma teachings that inspire you, or recalling the great masters, the great arahants of the past or of the present day. Anything which will just bring up this sense of inspiration and energy. So it's usually we're looking for inspiration from our teachers and from surroundings. But this is a very important skill that we need to how to inspire yourself, how to motivate yourself. You drawing upon your study. This is one of the values of Pariyatti. It's giving you like a fund. You've got this whole resource or database of inspiring materials that you can bring to your mind, and in order to create the necessary supporting conditions for development of meditation. So I think that myself, having spoken to so many meditators over such a long period of time, I'm not convinced that there's any one technique that's better than any other technique, but it's more the attitude with which you apply the technique that you've chosen. And being a little bit flexible, a little bit creative. And this is, when you sit down, this is my raw materials today, right now. This is what I've got to work with right now. So what's the most skillful way of working with this? It's not like how you'd like it to be, or you think it should be like this, or yesterday it was so good, why is it like this today, and then get caught up in doubts. But this is how it is right now. It's like this. So what's my best way forward, given what it's like? So is this the hindrances? They're like a kind of a spectrum. So you have very coarse expression of a hindrance, and then going all the way to very quite refined or subtle levels of hindrance. And so particularly as monastics, often like the third hindrance of sloth, torpor, dullness of mind. That's a big one for monks, isn't it? And the thing to be aware of is that the quality of the mind which is developing samadhi is this word gamaniyo. It's that like pliability, flexibility of mind. One teacher compared it to like copper wire. Like copper wire, you can bend it, it's very strong, but you can bend it this way and bend it that way. So if you're meditating and you not a lot of thoughts in your mind, you feel quite solid and good, but you have that kind of stiffness, that kind of rigid quality in your mind. That's the tinimita, the third hindrance, and the more subtle, and that's the one that many people get caught in, this kind of subtle stiffness of mind. So each of those hindrances, you deal with the coarser, and then you go on to refine. But if you look on it as an exploration and a learning process, rather than I got to do this in order to get that, but you say like, yeah, this is like I'm learning. I'm learning about the mind. I'm learning about the human mind. I'm learning about how to deal with the challenges. So even if you have a so-called bad meditation, it's actually, you can learn a lot from what's called bad meditations or difficult meditations. So it's that skill of how to look at it, how you're framing your practice. Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit biased, of course, as a forest monk, but I feel like, just as a natural habitat of a bird is the sky and a fish is the sea, natural habitat of a bhikkhu is the forest with the nature. But and I'm also reminded of the sutta in which the Buddha was talking about the future of Buddha Sasana, and he said, as long as bhikkhus take delight in forest life, the Buddha Sasana will not disappear from the world. So the Buddha obviously gave it a lot of support, a lot of importance. Nevertheless, I mean, I've often, when I first came to Thailand, I was a very idealistic young man, and I could not help but be critical of many of the monks I saw in the cities and the towns, very lax attitude towards the Vinaya, and living lives were not very, not in harmony, not as I thought monks should be living. But of course, after many years and understanding, I hope things are much better, my view changed, and I believe now that without the monks in the towns and the cities and the villages, then Buddhism may well have disappeared from Thailand or even Burma by now. Or else it would be a bit like Zen Buddhism in Japan. Presently it's very like elite, just a very small number of monks, and with a very little influence on the society at large. So the closer relationship between the monastics who are living in villages and towns and cities, and having daily contact with the lay people and being able to advise and teach and perform ceremonies, and the big picture of Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia, this is absolutely invaluable. Nevertheless, I think that there are a lot of problems and there's a lot of corruption involved, and particularly around money, because for hundreds of years it didn't really matter that the monks in the villages and towns and cities handled money, because nobody had any money. The lay people had no money. Monks would just have a very small amount of money just to buy most important requisites. But then as society changed and the people became much wealthier, then they wanted to share their wealth with the Sangha, and monks who were not keeping the precept about refraining from use of money found getting wealthy, and a lot of competition and rivalry and bad feeling and all kinds of excesses started to appear. So it's not so much living in the city and living in the town as the Vinaya, because the Vinaya and the precepts are what protect you. And my teacher said, you look after the precepts will look after you. So if you are living in a more busy environment, then it's even more important that you have very good standards of Vinaya to protect you, because the environment is not so protective as it is in the forest. I think that it's wonderful that there are monastics willing to make sacrifices and to be teaching lay people, but in my tradition, at least we say that at least for the first 5 years of monastic life, your ambition should be to be nobody. There'll be plenty of time to be somebody in the Buddhist world when you get more senior, but one of the great luxuries and one of the great most valuable things is to spend years where nobody knows who you are and where you don't have any expectations and any responsibilities towards larger Buddhist community. Then when you've developed that inner strength and inner maturity and knowledge and so on, then as you get more, then you can choose how to live your life in a way which is most fulfilling for yourself and for others. Even though you are perhaps living in a monastery or temple in the city, then it's still, I think, important to be taking periods of retreat. So having times of the year where you don't teach or you don't have activities, and let that be known within the community. So that might be for 3 months of the annual rains retreat, or in the Western monasteries where that 3-month period coincides with the summer, they shift their 3-month period to the beginning of the year in the winter. But the idea, I think, is a sound one, to have a period of time where you're just putting your emphasis and your efforts into your own practice in order to be able to carry on your duties and your service to others at other times without becoming overwhelmed. If you were to hear about in the Amazon jungle, there are still patches of the Amazon jungle which are completely unexplored, unreached, and in the middle there are these huge trees, majestic trees, some of the most beautiful and wonderful trees in the world. And even though you probably, in your lifetime, you won't ever see those trees or have anything to do with trees or even see photographs of the trees, it just feels really good to know that there are those trees there in the middle of the jungle. And I think knowing that there are monks practicing alone, or nuns, and people who are practicing and realizing fruits of the holy life, even if they're not playing any tangible role in making the world a better place, as it were, that's a wonderful thing. But that's just sort of one extreme example. I think that the monks have many different, and so including nuns in this, and monastics. One is that there's the integrity and the quality of sila, and knowing and seeing people who are practicing what they're preaching and trying to live by their ideals and living by a very high standard of sila, and to have groups of young men living together, whether it's 40, 50, there are monasteries with hundreds of monks, and that you could have a group of young men in their 20s and 30s and can live together in that kind of harmony and goodwill and kindness and care. I think that's an incredible lesson to the world. Something so I often encouraging young monks, just living your life as a monk, it's already, people see it and they're uplifted by it. And we, in my tradition, we built a number of monasteries in Western countries, and it was a question about how much of this tradition could be transplanted into non-Buddhist environment. And there are a lot of different views about it, of course. And my teacher, Ajahn Chah, just said, well, try and do everything the same way that you do it in Thailand, and then see what works and what doesn't work. You don't have to decide beforehand. And in fact, we found that we could practice almost exactly the same way, just some minor changes in clothing and wearing like long-sleeved angsas, shirts and things like this. But one aspect of the forest monk's life that nobody thought would be possible to transplant into the West is what we call tudong, or just like in Thailand and in Burma, I don't know, I suppose, just the monks just set off and walking through the forest and walking through the countryside, and then in the morning walk into village for alms food. And we thought, how would that ever work in a non-Buddhist country, where people are not Buddhists, and they see strange, bald-headed, robed figures walking through the town, who's going to give them anything to eat? And it's been absolutely incredible. We've had monks walking through from California up to Washington State, 2,000-kilometer walk, 2-3 months, only 2 days when they never got fed. Monks walking through Germany, France, England, Ireland, Italy, all over, and everywhere they go, people see monks, see people dressed this way. They're not Buddhists, don't have often any, and just something about the form, something about what we're doing, it just inspires people. They want to offer support. Often people will come up to you and say, give you money, and then you say, I can't take money. They say, what are you doing? I mean, is it even more inspired? So what, somebody doesn't want money, and then you say, only food, and then people say, well, just stay there, don't do anything. I just go in the shop and buy you something. So I have a lot of faith. This form is something which somehow it encourages goodness in people. On more tangible level, monks do a lot of teaching in schools, and when you just see all the things that Venerable Ajahn Kamai yesterday, he was in a big prison in Yangon and teaches in universities and has a wonderful reputation in England already after just a few years. This whole place, you just see that someone who applies himself to bhikkhu life with integrity and intelligence and faith, just how much goodness that they can bring into one place. And it's like a magnet. This form is like a magnet for goodness, I think. I myself lead reasonably secluded life, but I have all these people around me, this group who come and they do all these. So I kind of lazy fellow really, but I got all these very diligent people who record what I'm doing, and they put it on YouTube and they put it on podcasts, and so for me, technology, rather than being a distraction as it can be for many monks, means that I can just live my life quietly or visiting here, and then that's it's broadcast around the world, and so can feel that I am contributing some way to propagating Buddhist principles. And of course many monks are also writing books, and there are so many ways of sharing the Dhamma these days that weren't available before. Larger level, social level, the idea of Sangha is of a unifying force or body in the society. So when you have a lot of different political groups, right wing, left wing, rich, poor, etc., etc., the idea of the Sangha is that it's completely non-partisan, and whoever you are, the moment you enter the gates of the monastery, now you're just a Buddhist layman or a Buddhist laywoman. And ideally, the Sangha, the abbot, treats everybody equally. There's no special privileges for rich, wealthy donors. Everyone's treated with kindness and compassion. And often you find people coming together and chanting together and listening to Dhamma together, eating together in monasteries, who would never, have met in that way. And there is this sense of, we're all Buddhists together, and I think that monasteries provide that function in society. So it's so important that the monks don't become identified with any particular political party or political program. But what monks can say, without mentioning politicians or political programs or parties, we talk about the 5 precepts, and they say, well, this is in conflict with the 5 precepts. This is in conflict with the Buddhist teachings. This is so it's giving the Buddhist perspective on things, and being an organization which everybody recognizes doesn't have an axe to grind, doesn't have any kind of political programs or objectives. It's not beholden to anybody, and I think that's a role that the Sangha can and should be able to play. It's more complicated in countries like Burma, Myanmar and Sri Lanka because of the colonial history. It's clearer in Thailand. Was Thailand fortunate enough never to be colonized, and so the relationship between the monarchy and the Sangha and the independent and neutral role of the Sangha has been maintained quite well, I think, big picture. Whereas in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, then the effort to drive out the colonial masters, the British, meant that the Sangha, because most of the elite, the really smart people, were going to the Sangha. And so when the society's in turmoil, and who does it turn to? It turns to the monks. And so in Sri Lanka and Myanmar, the bhikkhus have had more of a overt political role because of the history. But still the ideal is to be that neutral refuge for everyone, irrespective of their social and political backgrounds. Yeah, I'm very unsystematic in my studies. I've whether it's studies of Thai language or my studies of the Pariyatti Dhamma, studies of Tipitaka, not anything really to hold up as an example to anybody else. I mean, I love the suttas. This is the main thing. And I've been fortunate enough to have been offered copies of the Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations and others. So I have an extensive bookshelf and library, and I spend periods where I pick up the Anguttara and look at the Anguttara for a couple of weeks, or I pick up the Majjhima and go back to the Majjhima. Majjhima was the first of the Bhikkhu Bodhi translations that I received many years ago now, and that's a treasure. Plus, I have been the monk, other than Ajahn Chah, the monk that I look up to and revere the most, and I've had fortunate enough to have a kind of close relationship now with for 30 years is Somdet Puttakosajan Pye Payutto, and his works have been great inspiration to me. He's someone who's extremely, I think of Thai scholars, he's one you can say definitely top level, and it's not just that his knowledge of sutta and Atthakatha and all the Tipitaka is so extensive, but for me his genius is that he's able to take the teachings out of particular contexts and apply them to the problems of the modern world. Where exactly in the Tripitaka do we find teachings that we can respond to the climate crisis or economic development and its pitfalls, or education system? And so for me, this is often the weakness of the scholarly approach. Is it's too much confined to the curriculums and to the particular form of the monastic education, whereas it's not like he's just consumed these, but he's fully digested them, and he's able to take from here and take from here and take from there, and to apply these things. And so I've learned a great deal from him and his scholarship, and I certainly look to him as my teacher in this. Sadhu.